For those of you unfamiliar with the military balance, I'll quickly talk a little bit about the book. It was first published in 1959. Back then it was 11 pages long, and the 2016 edition runs to 504 pages. We aim in the military balance to produce an authoritative, independent and accessible assessment of military capabilities in a portable printed volume. Over the years, the book's grown in size and in coverage, in line with the wider appreciation of the global impact of regional defence developments, conflict trends, but also in line with the expansion of the Institute's thematic and regional research agendas. From near exclusive focus on NATO and the Warsaw Pact, the book now covers military capabilities, defence economics and related policy developments for over 170 states. As Bastian said, we can't cover all the themes and trends in the military balance 2016, so I've picked out a few of particular interest and we can then explore those further in discussion. Key themes include some of those that Bastian mentioned in his brief introductory remarks. Advanced military capabilities and new and innovative technologies are proliferating and leading to an increasingly complex balance of military power. There is growing access across the world to military relevant high technologies. Many of these capabilities and technologies originate in the private sector. This presents a challenge for government not just in keeping pace with the latest technology, but also monitoring its proliferation and coping with the blurred boundaries between civil and military technologies. Russia and China are increasingly active in the development and deployment and sale of advanced military capabilities, and these states are increasingly willing to deploy military capability to further policy objectives. Turning to Europe. In Europe, the threats and risks to security have grown, but Europe's means to tackle them haven't recovered from the long cycle of defence cuts seen after 1989. When Western forces took part in the first major post-Cold War coalition operation, Desert Storm, in 1991, our data indicates that the UK had 475 combat aircraft and France 579. Today, 25 years later, the same totals are 194 and 271 respectively. Similarly, as this graphic illustrates, the period 1990 to 2015 saw a dramatic decline in combat battalion numbers in Germany, Italy, France, the UK and in US European Command, with overall numbers falling from 649 in 1990 to 185 in 2015. There's been much discussion over the last few years about defence budget cuts across Europe. After years of cuts, real budget outlays stabilised in 2015 for the first time since 2008, but resourcing future defence plans will remain difficult. In 2015, only 4 of the 26 European members of NATO met the 2% spending objective agreed at the 2014 Wales summit. For the remaining 22, the average percentage of GDP spent on defence was 1.1%. These countries would need to raise their collective outlays by nearly 45% to reach the target, or by almost $100 billion. Moreover, recent alliance operations have taken place in relatively uncontested air, sea and electromagnetic environments. This may not always be the case in future. For instance, Russia has deployed capabilities in its western military district that could impede access to and constrain freedom of action in the Baltic region. These include the S-400 air defence system, the Bastion coastal defence system and the MiG-31BM combat aircraft. Meanwhile, during a snap exercise in early 2015, Moscow for a short time moved Iskander-M short-range ballistic missiles into Kaliningrad. And Russia has longer-range standoff conventional capabilities that can reach targets in Europe from a launch well inside Russian territory. These include some of the advanced cruise missiles launched as part of Russia's Syria campaign. So previously, anti-access area denial had been spoken of mainly in the context of the Asia-Pacific. Now it concerns NATO in Europe and also potentially in the Eastern Mediterranean. As such, Russia's potential A2AD challenge calls into question the key element of NATO's plan agreed in the Wales summit in 2014 to rapidly reinforce its eastern allies. For NATO to meet this challenge, the alliance has to rediscover skills that have faded and renew capabilities that have been reduced. For instance, Russia's recapitalization of its cruise missile infantry raises questions as to NATO's ability to defend against such systems. Some NATO states have capabilities like Patriot missiles, but a key challenge remains adequate detection time and ensuring defensive coverage. Training needs to be broadened further. Air forces, for instance, have emphasized training against IR-guided manpads. Now training needs to increase against radar-guided air defense missiles like Russia's SA-20 and SA-21. Land forces need once again to take account of modern armoured forces and increased vulnerability from heavy rocket and artillery fire. In the maritime domain, awareness of an A2AD challenge should mean renewed attention on task force level anti-submarine warfare, as well as air defence against high-speed weapons and cruise missile threats. Maritime planners will need to consider new or different capabilities for high-threat scenarios. Another area of concern is electronic warfare. It can no longer be assumed that the electromagnetic spectrum is a permissive environment. Russia has EW'd evolved down to small unit level and has maintained investments in this area, developing high-powered jamming capability with the ability to disrupt UAVs and compromise communications. There needs to be renewed attention on the tactics and capabilities required to fight in environments where communications and the EW spectrum is contested, and also where GPS might be degraded. Turning to the Middle East, in Syria, Russia's intervention has of course bolstered the Assad regime, while also internationalizing what had been hitherto a civil war of largely regional significance. It also served Moscow in portraying Russia as a reliable and committed partner of its allies. Some regional states are still part of the US-led air campaign against IS, but regional attention is also now focused on Yemen, where, 1 year after the country saw the GCC launch its first major military operation, Operation Restoring Hope, this will soon enter its second year. However, while achieving military gains in Yemen, the intervention there has yet to decisively weaken the Houthi rebellion. Gulf states, however, remain concerned by Iran's military capabilities. As our data indicates, most of Iran's frontline combat air power dates back to the 1970s. The same goes for most of Iran's land and naval forces. Iran developed asymmetric capabilities, including its ballistic missile infantry, in part to offset its conventional weakness. Previously, Gulf states assumed that they would retain a qualitative edge over Iran. And although for a period of years there will remain restrictions on arms deals with Iran, if Iran rearms, the Gulf states' assumption of qualitative superiority may be challenged. For instance, 1 decade out, Gulf air forces looking to engage Iran's ballistic missiles before launch could encounter an air force much more capable of contesting its airspace and an integrated air defense network able to pose a significant challenge. Now, regional states cannot match Iran's armed forces in terms of size. So, regional defense planners will likely consider buying yet more advanced equipment capable of engaging targets faster and with more precision. Some Arab states and Israel have spent substantial sums on defence equipment in recent years, including on missile defence. Here, Gulf procurements have been largely driven by concerns over Iran's ballistic missile arsenal. But while the US has exhorted Gulf states to better coordinate these capabilities, the US still remains at the hub of regional missile defence. And our wall chart that you can see on the screen in front of you now, this year assesses missile defence capabilities in the Gulf region. Turning to the Asia-Pacific. In the Asia-Pacific region, China's military capabilities continue to grow. Not only is China launching more of its advanced Type 52D destroyers, but Beijing confirmed in 2015 that it was engaged in building its own aircraft carrier. It also expanded its overseas military activities. Meanwhile, the missiles displayed at the September Victory Parade underlined China's continued investment in A2AD systems. China continues to modernize its military organizations, forces and capabilities, and the PLA is engaged in increasingly realistic exercise scenarios, seen last year particularly in the Stride exercise series. Tensions continue over China's accelerating construction activities on features it occupied in the South China Sea. Regional states concerned by this and which had the means are boosting their own capabilities. Sustained, multi-year increases in defence spending reflect the elevated outlays on procurement in the past 5 years as states recapitalise ageing inventories and respond to new security concerns. Having overtaken total NATO European spending levels in 2012, as we highlighted in the military balance that year, our data now indicates that Asia spends nearly $100 billion more on defence than NATO's European member states. Now I'll talk briefly about capability and technology. Russia's employment of advanced cruise missiles over Syria and China's display of capabilities at its September 2015 military parade reinforced the fact that advanced weapon systems are no longer the preserve of Western states. These include capabilities suitable for A2AD tasks, armoured combat vehicles, ballistic missiles and land attack cruise missiles. Russia's Armata tank, and you can see an equipment graphic, we call them, for the Armata display on your screen in front of you now. The Armata tank, which was displayed at the May Victory Parade, utilises innovative technology developments and is a radical departure from previous Russian designs. Although that platform is not yet in service with the Russian armed forces, it will be revolutionary development if it does enter full service. The high technology developments recently seen in the West are increasingly mirrored elsewhere, as is illustrated by some of these high technology programs. Both Russia and China have programs to develop hypersonic glide vehicles and high-speed precision weapons. Unmanned systems, particularly UAVs, are now relatively common around the world. Noteworthy developments in the past year include the appearance of armed UAVs of Chinese origin in Iraq and also in Nigeria. Small UAVs, often of commercial origin, are increasingly finding their way into global inventories. The technological playing field, in sum, is levelling, and advanced military capability at all levels is proliferating. The cost of defence technology are falling, as are the barriers to entry. So for the West, how has it responded? One reaction is to try and stay ahead of the curve and to invest in new high technology areas such as cyberspace, data analytics, additive manufacturing, autonomy, robotics, directed energy weapons and such like. Another approach will be combining existing technologies in innovative ways, as in the US program to develop swarming UAVs by combining low-cost unmanned systems with autonomous technology. Meanwhile, much innovation is now driven by private sector and by business rather than government, and many dual-use capabilities have their origins in private sector. By partnering more with the private sector, defence establishments could look to share research and development costs in effect and benefit from the high technology sector's culture of innovation. Governments are looking to these partnerships to develop innovative leap-ahead technologies and also ways of working that would enable the West to retain its technological advantage. But we also have to anticipate that adversaries for Western states will be looking to do the same. In conclusion, for Western military powers, unfettered access is no longer a given, nor is technological superiority. Western military technological superiority, which has been a core assumption of the past 2 decades, is eroding. Slowing this emerging trend or reversing, certainly coming to terms with it, will be a key preoccupation of Western strategists in the coming decade. Now, this range of concurrent crises, in tandem with the pace of global military and technological change, including more assertive states, faster and more precise weapons, hybrid threats and cyber power, means that some concepts of the past might now need to be revisited. Deterrence is one. For instance, what do precise high-speed conventional weapons mean for traditional concepts of deterrence? Russia's 2014 military doctrine, for instance, for the first time mentioned prompt global strike as a military danger. Then there's the question of how or whether it's possible to deter hybrid attacks or to deal with hybrid attacks before they reach red lines that might lead to military responses. To do this effectively requires integration of civil and military capabilities and first understanding what vulnerabilities exist within and among states. This implies that states need to think hard about monitoring indicators that could provide early warning, and it puts a premium on intelligence capabilities. Then there's cyber, How can states deter the actions of adversaries, both state and non-state actors, in cyberspace? We start in this military balance to consider this in relation to cyberspace. Here we assess that though deterrence in that domain is a complex problem, it might not be impossible, and that provided there's a clear focus on the threat to be deterred and an understanding that there might not be a one-size-fits-all approach to deterrence in cyberspace. Indeed, the fact that major disruptions that could occur in cyberspace have not yet done so suggests that a degree of cyber deterrence might indeed already be at work. Now, our coverage in the Military Balance 2016 is global. The book is, as ever, replete with texts, graphics and maps illustrating defence statistics from around the world, such as this, which has been a top retweeted graphic in recent years among some defence analysts. This is our top 15 defence budgets, which we've run for the last 3 years, I believe. This illustrates that though other states are increasing their defence spend, the US still dominates. Thematic, regional and country analysis complement the capability data in the military balance. And we of course discuss other significant issues in other regions too, including Latin America and Africa. And with that I'll close and we can turn to Q&A.
James, thank you very much. And you put a lot on the table, and I can see already that questions are coming in. Do keep them coming. Do use the chat function to ask questions, and we'll do our best to get through them. There's a set of questions, James, that have to do with Russia and Syria, I'm going to group like 2 or 3 questions together here, asking about the impact that Russia has had and the lessons that we can draw. I mean, let's stay obviously on the subject area that we're most concerned with, defense and military analysis. What would you pull out as, at this stage, as the early lessons, military lessons, defense capability lessons, looking at Russia's military involvement in the conflict in Syria? What would you highlight as the key themes that emerge as we, obviously this is ongoing, but as we can see from this point and at this point in time? James.
Thanks, Bastian. I think, of course, there are 2 ways of looking at it. There's the lessons of Russia's involvement for Syria's armed forces and for the Russian armed forces themselves. I mean, for the Syrian armed forces, it's, of course, they've boosted air power capabilities, and also there's been a significant boost to morale, I would expect, and that's been evidenced by the progress that the Syrian armed forces have made in recent months since the Russian air operation began, and also, of course, there have been reports of Russian advisors on the ground also. But for the Russian armed forces, I think it usefully gives us an opportunity to examine the results of the military reform process began in 2008 and examine them for a service branch that we haven't yet had the opportunity to look at in some detail. For instance, in the Ukraine operations in Crimea, we had a chance to assess rapid reaction capabilities in some of the ground forces and also EW capabilities. Now we've got a chance to look at the Air Force and things like resupply. Now, Russia's demonstrated an ability to maintain an at times high tempo air operation over Syria. I think that was something people were questioning when the operation began late last year, how long they'd be able to keep this up. After all, it's been some time since the Russians have engaged in air operations of this tempo and using these capability levels. So although the Russian armed forces have been able to maintain this operation, in 2015 they had to requisition some ships from trade, or rather buy ships from trade to maintain the supplies. So you can see that potentially there was some form of capability logistic gap in operations at reach that was addressed rather by the Russian Ministry of Defense back in 2015. But the situation for combat air power is slightly different. I mean, unlike the 2008 Georgia war, where there were reports of aircrew shortages, meaning that some crews had to be taken from test flights and test ranges, we've now seen reports that the crews deployed in the Syria operation are from frontline units. However, for all the advanced capabilities that have been deployed by the Russian armed forces, and it's been noteworthy, of course, that this has been illustrated by the use of precision cruise missiles, and some of them that have been launched from aircraft that have transited thousands of miles on sorties, on one occasion I think flying around the UK and through into the Mediterranean before going back to home bases. We shouldn't forget that many of the capabilities and munitions used are effectively unguided. And this is in contrast to recent Western air operations where precision-guided munitions constitute an increasing proportion of the weapons used. More broadly, I think it's worth looking at the Russian armed forces and the progress of the reform process, particularly in terms of personnel. There's been a lot of stress on, I think, the aspiration to professionalise the Russian armed forces, and there are increasing statements put out about the number of contract servicemen and aspirations to increase the number of contract servicemen. But overall, the picture remains mixed. Contract personnel mainly serve in the airborne forces and special forces troops, as well as in submarines and other complex equipment areas. Having said that, conscription remains important, both in social terms and also in providing a pool of potential recruits for contract service. Now, the problem with that, the downside, is that retaining a mixed manning structure causes problems for units that are intended to be kept at high readiness. And that was something we identified in the Military Balance 2015 that hindered the full deployment, the full complement deployment of some rapid reaction units during the initial stages of the Crimea operation. And of course, more generally, the results of the Russian military reform process and analysis of Russian military capabilities more generally is something that we in the Defence and Military Analysis Programme have front and centre in our research priorities for the next year.
James, thank you very much. I think, thank you in particular for also wrapping into your answer a general assessment on the state of the reform process of the Russian armed forces, which was the second basket of questions that actually has come up here on the chat. And I think what we have seen is a very clear political commitment to that reform process, but of course now a macroeconomic environment that may, in the long run, change the ability to sustain that commitment. In other words, obviously energy prices, but also in general sanctions and pace of growth in Russia and elsewhere will surely take their toll. There are a couple of other buckets of questions that are emerging. There are a couple around India and Pakistan. There are a couple around hybrid warfare and a couple of other issues. I'll start perhaps with the hybrid warfare basket, and for the moment stay somewhat close to the Russian theme that we've just discussed. I mean, there are many people, James, who would probably say, well, hybrid warfare has been around for a long time. There's really not much new to see here. What is your view? Are we making up new labels for old problems? Is this something that that is a one-off event around Crimea and eastern Ukraine? Do you think it will stay with us? Will it shape the future of conflict as we know it? Will it travel to other regions? What is your view on this whole set of questions?
Well, I think you put your finger on it in a way. It's always been there. I mean, what's new, I think, we were talking about this in last year's military balance, is the sort of rapid integration of new technologies, the rapid application of new capabilities to these hybrid scenarios. And also that seems to illustrate, I think, that for many in the West, it's not just that there's been it's not just that this is anything new in particular, it's more that many Western states have had their attentions focused elsewhere. And I think there's a growing awareness that in some countries, let's say for including Russia, there is greater focus on, or has been greater focus on, the use of all levers of state power. For instance, soft power, as it was traditionally termed in the West, use of overseas broadcasting, use of or awareness of population vulnerabilities, and that raises greater concerns in the European context in the sense of how to identify potential sources of vulnerability within certain states that might feel themselves vulnerable to hybrid capabilities. Whose job is it to do this? And it's one thing we've talked about is whether there's an option there, an opportunity there for NATO and the EU to collaborate more closely together in developing the early indicators, the early warning signs that can determine perhaps when what might be termed a hybrid attack, let's say, on an area of critical national infrastructure, when that moves from a civilian response to potentially a military response scenario. I think there's a lot of work still to be done in developing a risk register in the European context of potential vulnerabilities. So I think it's not something new. I think in many respects it's that Western states were preoccupied by more pressing requirements in a way.
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to note that probably as Western governments were indeed occupied with other requirements, they woke up to a situation where a problem that they had thought was no longer a matter for their own geography, namely warfare, had returned to their borders. I want to move the conversation slightly onwards to the NATO summit. As you will know, NATO heads of state and government will meet in Warsaw in July of this year. They will, on their agenda will be this issue of hybrid warfare that James has just discussed. On their agenda will be questions of how to strengthen deterrence in this context. It will be about reassuring allies in the East, but it will also be about trying to find a balance between the southern flank, which sees conflict, and the eastern flank of NATO, which sees conflict. So I wonder, James, whether, it's obviously impossible to predict what will happen between now and then, and many of these conversations are moving targets, but what is your sense of what we can expect with a view to the NATO summit? Where do you think the conversation will turn to, and what might be some of the things that we might see come out of the NATO summit?
Well, I think as you yourself mentioned recently, in the European context, there's now a crisis of concurrency. Lots of conflicts ongoing simultaneously in various regions. Some of them have the potential, in terms of training requirements, to be high tempo, others are not. Looking forward to the Warsaw Summit, we've seen more reassurance initiatives over the last few weeks. You've seen the US announcement of a quadrupling of spend, and also for European theatre, and also potentially more personnel and more assets going in. But I think there's still a sense among some East European states that more could still be done, and you're still seeing some calls for a more permanent presence. Now, the way that some alliance partners are trying to address that is by effectively generating a continuous presence by rapid rotations of forces. However, that still doesn't mean permanence, even though equipment might still be there for some East European states. So I think although we've identified in the talk earlier some of the challenges to the 2014 agenda in terms of the difficulties for rapidly reinforcing allies that could be posed by some of the capabilities now present in the Russian Western Military District. But the reassurance initiatives are developing and are increasing. But I think what's apparent is that at the Warsaw Summit, there will be still pressure from Eastern allies to do more, and that the adaptation process began in Wales still has some way to go.
James, thank you. I think it's something that we can witness now is the understanding growing that strategic adaptation of NATO will not just be characterized by the period from Wales to Warsaw, as the slogan goes, but that actually, even though it is significant already, it will need to continue way past beyond Warsaw, and more thinking probably is necessary to define what will animate that particular adaptation in years to come. I want to move beyond the NATO focus and the European Eurasian theater that we spent a lot of time talking about so far, and point to one area that we haven't talked about at all so far. I mean, you mentioned that the book does speak a bit about, or not a bit, it speaks quite a lot actually about Latin America and Africa, regions that didn't feature in your statement, but that we nonetheless look at. And one of the questions from one of our participants here online is indeed, what are the interesting aspects in those areas with regards to Latin America, but I'd invite you to also say a few words about Africa, James, in whichever order you would like. What are the most important, most interesting aspects you would like to point out for those regions?
Thanks, Bastian. I mean, as I've done a lot of research on Africa in the past, I'm always pleased to be asked questions about Africa and also Latin America. We have, of course, in the military balance 7 regions. Africa and Latin America are 2 of those. And we're always keen to try and highlight security trends and procurement dynamics in those regions, as well as defence priorities, both on a national basis but also on a continental basis. And that's particularly interesting in the African context, where there's, over the last few years, last 10, 15 years, increasing continental engagement in the continent's security crises and increasing attempts to generate traction in continental responses to those security crises. Now, in Africa as a whole, of course, some of the key debates are prompted by the activities of Boko Haram and other Islamist groups in the Sahel, and for forces in that area, in those regions, that remains a principal task for those military forces. But addressing the actions of these groups requires continuing international attention and also military support. South Africa's armed forces, meanwhile, we have a special essay in the book this year on South African armed forces, face continued financial problems, but face also coping with a growing external role. And also South Africa retains ambitions to upgrade its military capabilities. Meanwhile, another one of the equipment graphics, we highlighted the Armata one earlier on, another one of our equipment graphics this year, or rather a graphic more generally, is on focuses on Africa as a market for China's defense exports. And in this graphic we assess observed deliveries of Chinese equipment by type to Africa from 2005 to 2015. Now, what that serves to do is, yes, it highlights that a lot of the deliveries are of armoured vehicles, but some are now of increasing high-tech military equipment, as we highlighted UAVs earlier. But interestingly, in terms of Chinese exports to Africa, we're now seeing a shift from copy production of former Soviet designs to increasing appearance of Chinese origin, Chinese designed military equipment on the continent. Now, in Africa more generally, there of course remain aspirations to develop continental standby forces to address the continent's security problems. But in recent years, the plans for this have become more complex. In recent military balances, we've traced the evolution and the aspirations for the African standby force concept, and also how that's become more multi-dimensional, and in some respects how that's led to or prompted a delay in the IOC for the ASF concept. Rapid response capabilities are required and are a central aspiration of the ASF, and the immediate response capability devised by the AU a few years ago as part of addressing that requirement. But the enablers required to rapidly deploy and sustain forces remain a problem for African armed forces. Turning to Latin America, regional defence activity is again dominated by the need to tackle organised crime and narco-trafficking. However, Colombia continues to plan for the future and challenges beyond those posed by FARC. And similarly, Mexico, and we cover Mexico in some detail this year too, like we did Colombia last year, Mexico has also adapted its forces to face internal threats and is now modernizing to prepare for new external roles. And we saw the President, I think last year it was, indicate a willingness to take part in UN operations.
James, thank you very much. It's a tour around the world, so to speak, that we're doing here. But I'm keen to make sure that we indeed touch upon different regions, which is of course also how we operate as an institute with a presence in North America and Europe and Asia and the Gulf region. And I want to turn, as I said earlier, there are a couple of questions around South China Sea, and a couple of questions around India and Pakistan, and nuclear weapons in the region. So there's again a very rich menu of potential topics that we can discuss. Let me pull out perhaps to start South China Sea, there's a quite a bit of development in doctrinal terms. There is of different navies in the region and around the region, and there are also procurement dynamics at work that feed into the A2AD cycle and drive this forward. I mean, if you just gave us a quick overview of procurement priorities in the region. What are people spending their money on? And would you say, as someone who has followed this dynamic over the last couple of years, would you say an arms race is taking place, or how would we characterize this? Is this like a normal modernization cycle, or is this actually something that goes beyond that and that is reaching a new quality? You mentioned the spending trends in your presentation, and you mentioned that in that region defense spending has surpassed that spending of NATO, European NATO members by quite some amount now. So what are your views on that whole regional dynamic that we can witness?
Thanks, Bastian. Well, I think you've always got to be quite careful when talking about military procurements, because in many cases, and in the Asia Pacific, this is certainly no exception, recapitalization of aging inventories is as much a driver for military procurements as a response to security concerns. However, I think there's been some indication that there have been what you could maybe call reactive procurements in recent years in the region. And a few years ago, we traced in a graphic in the military balance regional submarine procurements in the Asia Pacific. And that's been a noteworthy development in China, Japan, South Korea, and beyond. And of course, in late 2014, as we saw about in this year's book, India's Defence Acquisition Council gave the go-ahead for a Project 75I plan for 6 conventional submarines with AIP. Now, what AIP does, of course, gives you greater endurance time submerged, and that's one of the things that we tracked in this graphic a few years ago, that some of the submarines in the region now seem to be AIP fitted. There's also been, of course, a growth in combat air power in the region, combat air power capabilities, but also we've seen increasing focus, I suppose, in some states on helicopter carriers, flat tops, that can serve to promote military capabilities at reach. Now, as we highlight in a table in this year's book, Asia contains some of the world's most active armaments markets. And looking at a graphic, we have that graphic, it's on page 216 for those of you who have the military balance in front of you. We break it down by the Asia Pacific by its sub-region, and certain capability areas that are seeing particular activity in East Asia include airborne early warning, maritime patrol, air defense systems, but also APCs and AIFEs, attack helicopters, surveillance systems, and general principal surface combatants. And that indicates that procurement is in many ways a recapitalization in many of these countries, as well as I was saying earlier, a response to regional security concerns.
James, thank you. We're gonna circle back closer to home in a minute. But I was wondering, and the bridge will be via India and Pakistan. There's a question here that has been posed regarding NATO's role in that relationship, and whether that is something that NATO might want to think about as it develops a footprint beyond its core Euro-Atlantic region, as it develops its partnership formats. I mean, I think over the last couple of years we have seen a possibly a bit of a pendulum development in that area, where NATO at first spent a lot of time developing the so-called global partnerships and trying to find a role for itself beyond its Euro-Atlantic core, and then people have begun to feel, well, maybe that is diluting NATO's purpose a little bit. Maybe it is actually a stronger organization if it focuses on its core business. And of course, now we are in a situation where very much closer to home for NATO, threats and challenges have re-emerged. Do you think within NATO, James, is there still an appetite for the organization as such to turn towards these far-flung regions of the world where it may have something to offer, but at the same time it has issues closer to home that it needs to focus on? How do you strike that balance between NATO's core tasks, cooperative security, crisis management, collective defense? Where would you put the emphasis?
Well, it's an ongoing debate, I think, between with not just among NATO watchers, but also within the alliance. I think some of these debates will be aired in the run-up to Warsaw and at Warsaw, as I was saying earlier, with more pressure still from East European states to refocus on collective self-defense in the European context. But I don't think NATO's lost sight of what it can deliver to developing armed forces and security establishments around the world in terms of the lessons that they can derive by contact with NATO armed forces. For instance, we've seen in recent years, as I illustrated, that Colombian armed forces are looking overseas to deliver some of the lessons that they've learned from their operations over the last 10 to 15 years, but also to derive lessons from the activities of others. And Colombia and NATO have engaged in discussions over the last few years in this regard. Also, NATO, of course, maintains these aspirations to continue developing its overseas ties. It maintains a number of contacts with states in many regions of the world, and has also, I think it was agreed at the Wales Summit, to improve its defence capacity building efforts with other states. But I think you talked about far-flung areas of the world. I think what's apparent in this year's military balance, and I think will be apparent to the planners of NATO HQ, is that nowhere's really far-flung anymore. Security crises are intermixed, and events and occurrences at reach can have the ability to rapidly affect homelands in Europe. And I think that's one of the challenges that defence planners within NATO and security planners in the European context are going to have to consider and address more closely. As I said, the defence capacity building initiatives that agreed in Wales in 2014 are continuing. A key recipient of that is, of course, Ukraine, but also Jordan. Jordan was agreed as a recipient country, and it's a country that, of course, is undergoing serious strain from the amount of refugees that it's had to accept from the Syrian conflict in recent years.
James, thank you very much. I think we've come full circle around the world almost now, and so it is quite appropriate that the next question is actually on the United Kingdom. It is not the question you might expect, and we'll see whether it gets posed. So here's your invitation to ask a Brexit question if you feel like it. But the question actually has to do with the UK and its role in NATO. One of our listeners and viewers has asked specifically how we would see that develop. Obviously, the UK has published a strategic defense and security review late last year in 2015, which took, obviously based on its 2010 predecessor, took it upon itself to try and reverse some of the, shall we say, somewhat reduced capability with which the UK had to deal. So do you think the SDSR of 2015, does it mark, in your view, a turnaround? Is it a growing ambition that is expressed in that document? And how do you think, if at all, that will be felt within the Atlantic Alliance?
Thanks, Bastian. I think, as we've said ourselves recently, the SDSR addressed many of the capability reductions that were seen in the 2010 SDSR. However, they've yet to enter service, so there's a lot of time between now and then. I think it's clear that the UK is devoting more forces to training activities in Eastern Europe, and is looking to deepen its continuing and already deep level of defence interactions with NATO partners across the east of Europe, and also in operations more generally around the world. I think it's just building on the existing already high levels of military ties that exist between the UK and European NATO member states, and of course NATO states outside Europe, such as the US and Canada. I think SDSR 2015 is an important document, and of course not just in the defence context, because it addresses security more holistically. It talks about cyber capabilities as well, and it's of course was the national security strategy that appears at the same time is an interesting way of tying together these two documents, so that the defence strategy follows from a comprehensive assessment of what the UK security concerns actually are. I mean, inside the book we've got quite a good piece on SDSR, and we've put out a few recent blog pieces on it, so for more detail I'd direct you to those pieces on our website actually.
Excellent, thank you. Yes, indeed, there you'll find a lot of information, a couple of infographics to capture that dynamic. I'd like to conclude, James. I'd like to turn to one point which people haven't really picked up in their many questions that they have asked, but that featured in the latter part of your presentation, namely that whole issue around technology and how it is, or how defense technology in future might be developed. That whole challenge of coming to terms with a faster innovation cycle, the center of which might not be in the military, in core military business, but might be elsewhere, and the problems that might cause for military and defense actors, both in terms of, or in several ways really, in cultural terms, in just the ways of doing things. I mean, you've spoken about the difficulty of adjusting to the way in which civilian companies, technology companies, do their development, which in many ways differs quite dramatically from defense. And of course, the third offset in the US is trying to again get in front of technological development. But I was wondering how you feel that challenge will unfold in the next couple of years.
Yeah, thanks, Bastian. Although, as well as third offset, I think one of the interesting things that we highlighted in the introduction to the book have been the drives to try and leverage the lessons of new and high-tech sectors. For instance, I think DoD has stood up an organization called the Defense Innovation Unit Experimental in Silicon Valley that's designed to try and learn the lessons from new high-tech sectors. But that's a challenge for defense establishments and traditional defense industry that have been used to working in set ways for a number of years. We're already seeing, in some respects, traditional models challenged. In space launch is one in the US. I mean, perhaps this is a unique example where you have capabilities that have significant financial resources that can build innovative and experimental launch vehicles, and if they break, they're just able to do another one. They're not part of the same long-term procurement cycles that some defense establishments have been party to in previous years. So maybe there's a new way of working that defense establishments have to try and take account of. Also, defense establishments and defense industry will be working with new sectors. Look at cyberspace, for instance, where you've got defense organizations who are now having to integrate into their structures people whose very job it is to question decisions, to try and break things, to find ways around the norm. So integrating individuals and ideas into organizations that work on an orders basis is going to be an interesting challenge. And I think there was an interesting photograph, I'm using the word interesting a lot, but it is interesting. There was a good photograph that came out of a NATO exercise, I think it was Locked Shields last year, a cyber exercise. There's a person in uniform bending over a bank of monitors, and half the people there have got t-shirts on and ponytails because they're civilian operators. And that's going to be an interesting experience, I think, for defense organizations. Another one, I think, is just going to be how to maintain the culture of innovation. As I was just talking about, in some of these sectors, you've got companies now who are able to build things and break them. If they break, they build another one. They'll fix it. They won't necessarily be beholden to the same risk aversion, if that's the right way of putting it, that you might see in a traditional defense organization. So in the traditional sense, the model might be that a defense industry might look to acquire a company like that. But if you're looking to acquire a company like that, how do you maintain that culture of innovation? So it might also call for a new model of acquisition, so that ability to maintain an innovative high-tech edge is retained somehow, but still those companies are brought into a larger company organization. So there are a number of challenges, I think, that are facing defense organizations and defense industry over the next few years. Those are just some of them, and I think we're looking to explore those a little bit more in the collaborative work we're developing now with the Future Technology and Cyber Warfare Program at the IISS.
James, thank you very much. I think we will see more of this, that whole set of issues that you spoke about right at the end here. We're now 57 minutes into the webinar, and I'd like to draw it to a close to give people a chance to return to the rest of their schedule for today. James, but I'd like to thank you for your presentation and for the way in which you engaged with the questions posed by our audience. And of course, I'd like to thank our guests and our audience for being with us today, but also for engaging and asking many questions.